I am feeling a little wistful today, folks, because during today's episode, you will hear the final installment of our Erath Winery educational series. But guess what? You can still purchase the exclusive Four Top 6-pack of wines at a very nice discounted price by going to erath.com/thefourtop. So curl up with your Erath wine, enjoy this episode, and join me later in this episode when we take our sponsor break and hear the last little bit of Erath Pinot Noir history.
Some of those cellars that they do use, the strongest ones where they open those up, there's so much fungi on the ceilings. There's not much room for anything else. You guys get that? Not much room for anything else.
Oh gosh. Oh my gosh.
Hello and welcome to The Four Top. It's a roundtable discussion of today's hot button topics in the wine and food world. I'm your host, Catherine Cole, joined by co-host Martin Reyes, a master of wine, international wine consultant, winemaker, importer, and educator. Hello, Martin.
Hey, Catherine. How are you?
Pretty good. I'm so excited for this episode. This episode will be all about the nose, in which we will have a surprising discussion about the senses and the aromas we find not only in wine, but in the world around us.
I'm definitely excited about this. This is awesome.
Our panelists are Harold McGee, a writer, lecturer, and authority on the chemistry of foods and cooking, whose most recent book is entitled Nosedive, a field guide to the world's smells. Welcome, Harold.
Hello, Catherine. Hello, Martin. Wonderful to be with you.
So good to have you. And Dr. Hoby Wedler, a PhD chemist, founder of the nonprofit Accessible Science, co-founder of Hoby's, a food and beverage products and services company, and also named by President Barack Obama as a champion of change. So excited to have you here, Hoby.
It is an honor to be here. Really, really excited to be on with you, Catherine, Martin, and Harold. It's funny, too, because Harold and I have been trying to plan a chat for a few years now, and this is where it's going to happen, and that is awesome.
That's awesome.
I cannot wait to listen to you two just get really geeky about senses and noses and all these fun topics that we wine geeks love to hear about. So let's just dig into this episode. Noses have actually been in the news more than usual since March 2020 due to the fact that one of the lingering effects of the COVID pandemic has been that a number of victims continue to suffer anosmia. I don't even know if I'm pronouncing that correctly. That is, they have lost their senses of smell, either temporarily or permanently. Now, Hoby, I have a feeling you have done a lot of thinking about this, and you may have some perspective on what it's like to be without a sense in that you have been blind since birth. So I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this epidemic of anosmia or anosmia. What are they losing from their lives when they lose the sense of smell?
I'll tell you what's really funny. It's a great question, first of all, Catherine. As a completely blind person, and now one who has gotten deep into the world of sensory expertise and what I call sensory literacy, which I'd love to unpack in a minute. I use my nose a lot for my survival as a traveler, as I navigate the world, and frankly, for my living, as my work. I am a sensory expert and do a lot of product consulting, both in understanding and translating the connection really between science and what people are smelling, and able to popularize that to marketing teams and in product development. So I need my nose, and I took it very seriously with the pandemic and really didn't travel at all since March of last year. One of the things that I think sighted folks don't realize is how much they take their eyesight for granted. And I say eyesight very carefully there because I think all of us have vision. Some of us just might lack eyesight. And, there's some really interesting articles out there. There's a great story in the New York Times about a reporter who had anosmia and actually didn't realize that her cabin was filling up with propane as she was trying to light a furnace, or a stove rather, until friend or a relative came in and said, "Oh my God, you're about to, burn the house down." And she had anosmia for her whole life and really dug into an understanding of how people dealt with anosmia, who have experienced the coronavirus and had COVID-19. And the overwhelming response, and I've done my own research and development here and interviewing, dozens of people who have lost their senses of smell and taste, by the way, the overwhelming response is, I had no idea how much joy I got out of life through my sense of smell, whether it's smelling grandma's cooking, to the maybe unpleasant or pleasant smell of an airplane, several people say, to the just the smell of the outdoors. And I think a lot of us, all of us in this round table, know how important our sense of smell is. But it's funny to think about, and a little terrifying, frankly, to think about how much losing that sense affects people when they don't even know it. And just one more quick thing on that. I think that we all are so visually literate because our eyesight it doesn't, it's not a vulnerable sense. When we get close enough to something to smell it, we're taking on a lot of vulnerability and trust. So we don't necessarily use our sense of smell to acquire as much information about our surroundings as we necessarily could, but we do use it sort of subconsciously and along with the other four senses way more than we acknowledge.
So true. So true. And I love that you pointed out that our sense of smell can actually save our lives.
Yeah.
Harold, your book Nosedive came out. It was very well timed, wasn't it? Tell us more. How can our sense of smell save our lives?
Well, Hoby just described how we can depend on our sense of smell to detect danger. An unlit gas outlet on a stove and that kind of thing. We can tell by sniffing at foods whether they're possibly off. It'll certainly make us more wary of foods that are questionable. And I have to say that I lost my sense of smell in the course of writing this book about the sense of smell,
Really?
which was a very upsetting experience. Had nothing to do with COVID. It was several years ago. And it turns out I learned, because I had that experience, that it's not an uncommon experience. It's caused by lots of viruses and head injuries and all sorts of things. So it is a vulnerable sense in that sense. And it really does change your life. I ended up really taking no interest in food and drink after a week or two because there just wasn't the same pleasure that there had been before. And that's a kind of indirect danger to one's health, because if you no longer have the urge to feed yourself a nourishing diet, if you no longer take pleasure in those small things of life, well, that's not good for you.
That's true.
Harold, can you tell us just a little bit, because I've been, for a few days at a time without the sense of smell. What does it feel like? What is it? Are there, other than food and drink, are there other areas of life that just aren't as fun? Like, is hiking not as fun anymore? Walking through city streets. I mean, it's one of my biggest fears, to be completely honest with you, and I'm so sorry you had to endure that. I did not know that.
Yeah, no, it's true that, as you said, once you lose it, you begin to realize what it is that you used to experience through it. So just as you say, the smell of the outdoors, the smell of your own house or the house of friends, the smell of companions, the smell of pets, flowers in the springtime, autumn leaves in the fall. The list just goes on and on and on. We're surrounded by these little bits of the world around us, which is what smell is reporting on. And when our access to them is shut off in that way, then the world becomes a much drabber place.
It seems to me that when we think about how we derive emotion, whether it's fear, anger, happiness, sadness, melancholy, right? That the senses are, other than memory, are the primary drivers of that, right? And I think somewhere along the line, I read a little bit about what your book was saying regarding the connection that it has to like the deeper, oldest part of our brain, right, where we can connect decades, years from an earlier memory that just comes right back to you. And if that memory is imbued with a sense of nostalgia or emotion, or if the hikes, or if the coffee that I'm giving my son right now a smell of the espressos that I make in the morning. He's a 2-year-old, and right now I feel like I'm building his past when he grows up,
Mm-hmm.
because he takes a smell of that freshly ground coffee. He's never had it before, and he goes, Papa, cafe. And then after a few times, he says, rico. I could only imagine that when he's older, he may not always drink coffee, but I get the sense that there's this like primordial connection that he has, that we all have our own, right? Evocation or emotion. And so when you lose it, like you described and what Hoby is terrified of, I think we all are. Wouldn't we say that like you lose, like you get shut out of this deep link to some of your humanity on some level?
Yeah, that's absolutely true. In fact, your example reminds me that one of my absolute earliest memories is not of coffee, but of coffee ice cream. So and I was probably 3 years old at the time, something like that, but my parents took me to an ice cream stand, and I'd never had, I don't think, ice cream at all, and I had certainly never had coffee ice cream. And boy, did it make an impression. And just your mentioning that, brings the whole experience back to me as well.
Now, I have a question for you both, Harold and Hoby. When Martine mentioned the espresso, I was sort of conjuring a smell. But then, Harold, you mentioned the coffee ice cream, and I was conjuring a taste, a flavor. So how are the sense of smell and the smell of taste related?
It's kind of amazing how interrelated they are. So taste is a very interesting thing. Taste, I'll just say it. The tongue is pretty stupid, okay? The tongue can sense sour, bitter, salty, sweet, and if you're really nerdy like Harold and Martine and Catherine and myself, a few other things, including umami, which is sort of a sense of meatiness. The really complex way that we taste and smell food is our nose. So when we have something on our palate and we breathe out through our nose, we're able to retronasally experience it, which means that your nose has a cute little check valve right up in the bridge of your nose. So when you breathe in, you smell all the smells of your surroundings. And when you breathe out through your nose, you are smelling all the smells that are going on inside your mouth cavity. And I read a study at one point that said that 98% of the taste experience is actually through smell. So what I implore you all to try, and every listener out there, is take something with a pretty strong flavor that's recognizable. I don't know, like an Oreo cookie. Just use that as an example. And taste that Oreo cookie completely from start to finish while plugging your nose. And you'll notice the experience to be highly different and probably a lot less satisfying. And I think that really probably ties in, Harold, doesn't it, to the lack of enjoyment of food and drink, and including the taste of food and drink once something hits your palate.
Yeah, no, that's a good way to put it. I like to think of taste not so much as a dumb sense, or the tongue as a dumb organ, but as providing the foundation for flavor. So you have those 4 or 5 basic tastes, and then on top of that, you've got the superstructure with all kinds of possibilities of numbers of stories and structures of rooms and that kind of thing. That's the aroma. Without the superstructure, then all you've got is the basement.
Good way to describe it.
The basement gives you something, so, and in fact, that's what I ended up convincing myself to try to enjoy, would be the balance of sweet and sour and salty, and also pungent. The sensation of hot peppers. Mm-hmm. That can help make up to some extent for the lack of aroma, but it only goes part way.
I want to touch quickly on this idea of having smell be so much more evocative of memories than eyesight. One of the reasons that I've found is that our brains actually have to work harder than we might think to see things. Literally, the way your eye works is there's a substance in your retina called retinal. We chemists aren't very creative when naming things. So retinal. And your body turns transretinal or cisretinal back into transretinal, which is the lower energy form of it. And when you look at light rays, transretinal in very specific quantities is converted to cisretinal. And that information is then carried through several hundred neuron bridges to your optic nerve. And just the exact amount of retinol that was converted gives your brain color information and all sorts of information to process. And it actually takes well over 5 milliseconds to process an image, because once your brain knows what it looked at, it has to flip it over, because everything that initially you see is a flipped over upside down image of what your brain perceives. And when we smell something, the neuron bridge from your olfactory bulb right into your cerebral cortex is a lot shorter. And your nose, therefore, delivers a lot more primitive data, and it can almost take you places. I feel like my nose, I don't know about the rest of you, I'd love to hear, my nose transforms where I am. I traveled to Mexico with my family a lot because my family dad's parents had a house in southern Mexico. We would travel down to see them a lot. I was a very young child. And now when I smell any number of smells that remind me even vaguely of that, I immediately am, happily visiting my grandparents as a young child. It's transformative. It pulls you. Whereas if you're looking at a wedding photo and you see someone and you see yourself drinking a glass of champagne, it doesn't bring you back the same way. You might say, oh, that jogs a memory of, yeah, that was so-and-so's wedding, and I was having champagne with her, and yeah, okay, that's right. But it's not that same depth and richness of understanding.
So true. And I love that segue because guess what? This is the wine season of the Four Tops. So, of course, we have to
Woo-hoo.
get geeky on the subject of wine. A basic tenet of wine appreciation is that wine is like art. It hits different people in different ways. Say, I smell blueberries in this glass of wine, you might smell
Yeah.
plums. The concept makes wine appreciation more approachable. But Harold, in your book, Nosedive, you identify and break down pretty much every identifiable aroma to the molecular level, including a number of aromas that can actually be found in wine. So I'm worried. Does this mean that the perfume of a wine is actually not subjective? It's actually something that you can measure?
Well, in fact, the reason that I included all those molecules was to make exactly the point that our perception of aromas is subjective because it depends on our database of experience and our olfactory receptors and that kind of thing. But our perceptions are being triggered by objective things, by volatile molecules that are escaping from the surface of the wine, flying through the air up into our nose, and then triggering those perceptions. So what I wanted to do is provide the kind of objective template for what's out there. Whether any given person with a particular database and set of receptors detects all those molecules, or whether we're even paying attention. We may just be enjoying a glass of wine and chatting with people and kind of vaguely registering the fact that it's a delicious wine, but not really dissecting it. No matter what our state of mind is, those molecules are there in the wine. And that's what I wanted to do, was provide that objective template so that if you happen to go hunting, these are the kinds of things you might find.
In your book, Harold, you mentioned how the way in which the nose can develop into what you call almost like you're growing a new organ when you develop it, when you learn to pay attention to it. And that sensory literacy, Hoby, that you referenced earlier, that you are you're fluent in the olfactory sense in a way that someone could be fluent in a different language. And if you start looking at that, that to me is a fascinating bridge for people to start to understand and be less intimidated about wine, but also understand what this whole thing's about, what the senses are about, is like a new language,
Yeah.
or like developing an organ that wasn't there before.
The way I think about it is exactly like you said, Martine, in terms of making wine more approachable. It becomes more approachable, I truly believe, when we practice our senses and our abilities to use those senses to understand things. And it's about, really, for me, smelling things around me wherever I am and making mental notes of what I'm smelling, and then drawing on those notes whenever I'm smelling something and talking about it, and working on a lexicon for it, or any number of the sort of things, or describing a wine to folks. It's about calling on those aromas. So for me, I get the same sensation when and it feels like my brain is doing the same thing. Maybe we'll have to shove me in an MRI sometime and see. Um, like when I'm traveling and I'm recalling different twists and turns in a path, or I'm studying an organic chemistry reaction mechanism and needing to understand and build the molecule in my mind. When I smell things, I pull on that same sort of repository of data. When I describe things that involve non-visual senses using my sensory literacy to sighted people, I do it in a way that I like it when sighted people describe things they can see to me.
Oh, I love that. I love what you're saying, Hoby, and I agree with all of you that wine is an emotional experience. But I'm a little worried because I keep reading these articles about computers and smartphones that can smell. They can smell disease. They can smell fire, and it's great. They're gonna be saving our lives. But I'm worried that smartphones will soon be able to do our tasting notes for us.
Well, and that's fine, but they won't be written with such elegance, and they won't be as evocative. But if you want to think about it that way, honestly, Catherine, fire smoke is artistic. Fire smoke is subjective. Just like the way it smells after a rain is going to be different anywhere depending on where you are and what the ground cover is. So in a sense, everything is subjective, and we just don't think to describe, quite honestly, some of the beautiful nuances of fire smoke. We just say it smells like smoke. But if I say, okay, what did you think of the cherry wood which I used to smoke this brisket? Then you start saying, wow, smoke is delicious. Then you start smelling the brush fires around you, saying, well, this is interesting, and it's not all bad because there's some really interesting aromatics here.
I agree with what Hobie's saying, and in part because I think that, I mean, I know that my profile in wine is reasonably well documented, and at the same time, I know that I make hundreds of mistakes every day about what I think I'm tasting. Catherine, you, I'm sure, would say the same. Most wine pros know humbly in their heart that they feel like they are not that gas chromatography type of analyzer, no matter how much we train. And you're right, Hobie, when you say, "Oh, that smells like fire," or smells like wood burning. But then when you get if you're able to use your smartphone to analyze the chemical like nuances around that, I think that opens up a whole new door of a new window of
Yeah.
comparing things that I thought were similar to each other. And I think it actually opens up, yeah, this like curiosity of now that I know what this or what that smells like, because there's an actual part of technology that gives me the output of what I'm not a computer. I'm just a regular guy, right? I
Mhm.
feel excited by that potential of science informing what is this often poetic mystery, or just this haze of not being able to tell the nuance that a regular computer can quickly tell us about. I think it's fun.
I think it's fun, but I also think we can live in our own wonderful environments of not necessarily relying on science and saying, science is great. I'm a scientist, and I believe in the importance of it for sure. But if I'm describing a Russian River Pinot Noir, sometimes I just want it to be Russian River Pinot Noir and not, oh, do you smell the cherry cola aroma, which is caused by this much vanillaldehyde, et cetera, et cetera. Like in a certain point, we can choose whether or not we want to use the technology,
Right.
and I
Totally.
think that's the beautiful thing about it.
I love wine tastings because it's a chance for us to share our perceptions, all of which are going to be a little bit different from everyone else, and we learn how to enjoy and appreciate aspects of wines from each other,
Mhm.
from each other's experiences. And to me, uh, a smartphone or whatever device it might end up being would just be another voice at the table, uh, not a particularly eloquent one, because all it could say in the voice of Hal the computer is there is vanillaldehyde in this Russian River Pinot Noir. But if you then know that that molecule is there, you can go hunting for it. You can ask yourself whether maybe something that you were thinking is a little bit more like benzaldehyde, the cherry aroma. Maybe it really is more in the direction of vanilla. It just helps you get more out of the experience by paying closer and closer attention to what it is that you yourself are experiencing.
One of the most fascinating things in the book is when I read that Amazon ants have a lemongrass and ginger. Is that right? Lemongrass and ginger
Yes.
flavor, or that flavor, and then that you said, well, to the Amazonians, ginger and lemongrass smells like ants, and that's why the soup is delicious. So our frame of reference is subjective, even if this is what you said in your book, that even if we can admit that there is hundreds or thousands of molecules and esters and all these aromas that can be categorized, and that Hoby and I and Catherine agree, okay, maybe you can categorize them, you still are always going to have that subjectivity of what that smell that is related to either the ant soup in the Amazon, or lemongrass, which share that chemistry, but it evoke different things. So I love the picture you painted around the idea of going to tastings with multiple people, because then you get to open up your own mind to what other people think of, whether they're childhood smells or aromas, and then that makes the conversation so much more fascinating.
Harold, did you get to taste that soup?
I did not get to taste the soup, but I did get to taste the ants. So I didn't have the opportunity, Hoby, to travel to the Amazon. But luckily, Alex Atala, a wonderful Brazilian chef, brought some ants to a convention of chefs a few years ago and passed them around so that we could get a taste from a distance. And
Wow.
And it was wonderful because he made the point that we all have these kind of unspoken assumptions about what goes with what and what to expect from a particular ingredient or a particular wine. But in fact, if you're just completely open about it and ready to experience whatever that moment gives you, you may end up with a very different sense of things.
I love what you're saying, all of you, and I love this notion of this ant in South America that shares aromatic similarities with flavorings that come from Asia. And Harold, in your book, you pinpoint that the fact that many of these aromatics are also exist in space.
That's right, Catherine. I have a confession to make. I started out life thinking I was going to be an astronomer. And so I've always had this interest in the stars. When I started to think more broadly about taste and smell, because this book began as a book about flavor and then turned into a field guide to the smells of the universe. The reason I ended up taking that very, very deep dive is that I began to wonder when it would have been in the history of the universe that we would begin to recognize molecules that are common in our everyday lives here on Earth. And it turns out that the answer is long, long, long ago, before there were planets, of course, before there was life. There are molecules out there, esters, that are very typical of fruits and very important in the flavors of wine. You can find esters in interstellar space, where they form not because a grape has been growing there, but because it's simply in the nature of the chemical elements that, given the right conditions, these atoms will come together in these particular configurations. So it's not to say that that when we're tasting an ester in a wine, we're tasting some primeval molecule. But it is to say that there is this kind of fundamental chemical reality to the universe that makes possible the things that we enjoy in a glass of wine.
What you remind us of so well there, Harold, that all these things that we're smelling on Earth that are in our wine are really just iterations of elements that were formed light years away, most
The
likely,
heart of stars, right?
that we're just recreating and reiterating as we grow things, and it's just really quite a magnificent and overwhelming thought to me that the ethyl acetate that I'm smelling in the cab that I'm going to have, the Hell Mountain cab that I'm going to have later tonight, actually originated. All the elements of that originated far away and a long time ago.
Yeah, and at unimaginable temperatures, in as Martina is saying, in the center of stars. Yeah, it is mind-boggling.
Well, I will feel very close to my space alien friends the next time I smell some wine. I love this. I love the universality of aromas. I hate to cut everyone off, but I think we need to take a quick break to hear from our sponsors. I can't wait to get back to this conversation, though, and hear more about the sense of smell. Well, the time has come for our final ERATH education sponsor break, and you may have already ordered the 4-Top 6-pack for yourself, but you still have time to order it as a gift. This is such a fantastic deal. It's 6 bottles of ERATH wines selected just for the 4-Top listeners and offered at an amazing price. You can get that at erath.com/the4top. And today we are tasting a new offering, the ERATH 2019 Reserve Collection Pinot Noir. This is a delicious Pinot Noir. I'm really enjoying it, and I want to hear what Rachel and Izzy have to say. So Rachel, what do you think of this wine?
I think it's bright and rich and complex, and there's a lot of ripe cherry in there. And then again, all of that, delicious spicy stuff that we love from our Oregon Pinot Noir. I love it.
How about you, Izzy?
Yeah, it's perfect just as it's starting to get chilly outside. It just makes me want to curl up. You mentioned that earlier in the episode, and that's exactly what I want to do now.
Yeah, this is a cozy wine for sure. Well, after sipping this cozy wine, it makes us wonder what is next for ERATH. This is such a prominent and historic Oregon wine label. But times are changing, and I am so happy to say that ERATH actually has a fairly new tasting room in Portland's Pearl District. And this is in the same building where my old office was. It's a really great spot. It's at Northwest 15th and Marshall. I know it well. It's a really historic old brick building. And actually, if you look closely at the paint on the side of the building, it says wines. I think it used to be a wine distributor 100 years ago. So it's such a cool spot for the ERATH tasting room. This urban space features a tasting bar and spacious seating for small and large groups alike, while offering unique wine tasting experiences across their portfolio of current and library vintages. All right, well, if you can believe it, we've already reached the end of the ERATH education series. Please be sure to visit erath.com/the4top to get that exclusive offer on our special 6-bottle set of must-have ERATH wines, including each wine we've sipped during this series. And just to recap, we have been tasting the 2019 Oregon Pinot Noir, the 2019 Oregon Pinot Noir Rosé, 2015 La Nuit Magique Pinot Noir, and I think we forgot to mention when we tasted that wine how beautiful the bottle is. It's just gorgeous. Look it up. The 2017 Knight's Gambit Pinot Noir, the 2019 Oregon Pinot Gris, and the 2019 Reserve Collection Pinot, which we are tasting right now. Get your 4-Top 6-pack at erath.com/the4top to save nearly $40 on these delicious wines. And don't forget, you can knock an additional 10% off that price if you join the ERATH mailing list before you shop. Thanks so much, ERATH Winery. You guys are the best. This has been really fun, and we really loved talking about wine with you and tasting your delicious wines. So cheers. Cheers, Izzy. Cheers, Rachel.
Cheers. Cheers. Thank you, ERATH.
Well, now it's time for the final part of this episode. I just want to have a free-for-all. I just want to listen to the three of you. You are 3 of the finest noses and minds in the business, and I want to hear you all just geek out about aromatics. So, Martine, in order to achieve your Master of Wine title, you had to identify just about every weird wine smell out there. So maybe you can start us off. What was the craziest scent you've ever come across in a wine?
I think that the strangest scent that we can talk about in wine that is unusual because it doesn't sound good when you imagine it is the petrol, kerosene, chemically some smell of certain Rieslings, not just German ones, but certain Rieslings all over the world that can creep into that. When you identify it, it's there. It is most often associated with that grape, with Riesling, and in particular,
Mhm.
sometimes there's all kinds of ways it can manifest, and there's a whole science behind that. But I think it makes me wonder. My world is wine, yet it's such a small part of the bigger world of the senses, the bigger world of the nose. Right? We enter this huge one that crosses paths from food to animal to nature to space, right? And it gives me a sense of how small we are.
Martine, that's exactly what pushed me into taking 10 years to write this book. I promised I would be done in 2, so for 8 years I was overdue, which was not a great feeling. But that's exactly why I ended up delving into interstellar space and Amazonian ants and that kind of thing, was wondering why it was that, particularly in the wine world, people detect smells of things that are not grapes, and they're not even fruits. They might be flowers. They might be the forest floor. They might be sweaty saddle. They might be cat pee. And I just decided I had to understand why does cat pee smell the way it does? Why does a sweaty saddle smell the way it does? In
Mhm.
order to understand the connection between those things and what it is that we experience in a wine.
To me, the sense of smell is definitely a scientific tool. And I feel like I understand it somewhat as a scientist, but my goal with the senses of smell and taste is truly to make people happy. That is where I think the nose can be such a powerful thing, is if we can show people happiness through great aroma and flavor. And to that end, the tagline for this new company that does food products and hoping to do a wine soon, as well as services in the, sensory strategy work, our tagline is elevating happiness. Because I think that by like creating flavors that totally enhance the moments in our lives that matter, or just the mundane moments of eating lunch in the workroom at work, that that brings happiness. That's just, to me, the sense of smell, even if we're smelling aromas that are unpleasant, makes us think and can make us happy, and frankly can make every Monday night when we eat dinner a celebration. That's what I want to show, is that our noses make us happy.
You touch on that beautiful element, and actually, Harold, you had a phrase towards the end, says like fermentation, whether at some point eventually becomes a partial decomposition,
Yes.
right? And that the things that are become rancid or they turn vinegary, and then whether it's wine or any other kind of thing, but obviously we're biased with wine. I am, anyways. I think you are too, Harold, because you mentioned it all over your book. I'm just going to call you out
I
as
am as
biased.
well.
And you are too. That it recaptures some of the things that you just said, Hoby, about some of the unpleasant things like oxidized, rancid, decomposed. That's some of the best wines out there.
Mm-hmm.
Rescue those rescue the liquid back from putridity or decomposition and bring them into the sense with their balance of everything else they're doing into a pleasing aspect. Some of the world's greatest dessert wines are essentially made out of rotting, to put it bluntly, grapes. Right? It's we don't have to get into the how and the why, but that happens. Or, the enemy of wine, two enemies of wine are heat and oxygen, right? Both of those can just kill most of the wines that we drink. Or same thing with milk, right? That spoilage, or over time, you just can't. You just have to let it go and dump it. But yet you create cheese, or you create, in our world, you create this beautiful sherry or Madeira or port or even old champagnes, and even some of the rotten smells that I get from natto, that wildly funky Japanese thing. To me, it smells putrid, and to my wife, she's half Japanese, she just gobbles it up.
And
and it's
natto, that's fermented soybeans, right?
fermented
Yeah.
soybeans. Yeah.
When you said when you were talking about the enemy of wine, I thought you were going to say beer, Martine. There's often
Well,
wars in this world about the wine people, or are you a beer people? And I have to say that I am a self-proclaimed cross drinker. I'll take it all.
For winemakers, I do make a little bit of wine, and we have a saying that it takes a lot of beer to make good wine. We do drink it
That's true.
often in the winery to during the harvest, especially when it gets into the warm August, September, and so forth.
Martine, which wines do you make?
Oh, I make a little bit of Sonoma Chardonnay and Russian River Chardonnay and Pinot Noir, and then a little bit of Napa Cab too. So
Amazing. Amazing.
Can I jump in and get back to the topic of rot and
What?
decay, because I'm dying to ask
yeah.
Harold. Harold, I have always been so curious about those wine cellars in Europe where you just see mold and fungus just like hanging from the ceiling, and it just has never been cleared out, and it seems to somehow contribute to the wine. Can you explain to us what's going on there?
Well, it turns out that those really ugly, disgusting, kind of creepy-looking filaments of black fungus that hang from the walls and ceilings of a lot of wineries, older wineries, of course, in Europe, but also distilleries in the rest of the world. Those are actually particular fungi, particular relatives of mushrooms, that actually thrive on the fumes being given off by the barrels of whatever fermented liquid is in the cellar, whether it's wine or a distillate of some kind. And so it turns out that they're actually living on the product of the yeasts that made the alcohol in the first place, but they're also living on trace volatile molecules that are not so good for us. I mean, alcohol, it's not good for us in large quantities, but otherwise it's okay. But there are other things like formaldehyde that are being given off slowly in these cellars that these shaggy black fungi just thrive on. So some winemakers will actually feed their black fungus by leaving barrels of wine partly open, so that they're nice and healthy, so that they'll help actually improve the air quality in the cellars.
Oh my gosh, you just blew my mind. So
That's incredible.
I was just going to say, so Harold, I feel like this means that all these American winemakers who are obsessed with having clean cellars maybe need to just relax and let some fungus grow. Is that what I'm hearing?
Well, I wouldn't go that far because
Okay.
these European cellars, they've evolved over the course of probably centuries. If you're building a new winery, or you're in a winery that's only been around for a couple of decades, and you're not careful about hygiene, then you're probably going to end up with something you really don't want, like Brett. So I think you have to have the history to go along with the helpful black fungi.
And in support of New World winemakers, particularly those in the United States, what's kind of interesting is that the wines, and I know this is a controversial subject, so I'm going to be very careful what I say here.
Nah, go for it.
The wines in California, for instance, have so much stylistic approach made by the winemaker. The winemaker has, and the vintner, for that matter, have so many decisions that they can make, and they can add their artistic stamp by how long they ferment, how long they age, how often they rack, which means pour the wine off of any solids that form on it. So many variables that I won't even go into because then I'll be really getting geeky. They can really make their own expression. Whereas, let's just take France as an example. They're forced by the controlled appellations to make very specific varietals in a very specific way. So, I think old world wines are absolutely fascinating, but in some respect, I think that, more of the terroir of the New World is actually the people and less the place. And I know that's controversial, but I just think it's very interesting to think about how, in some senses, what happens in wineries in the US, they're not following the European model, sometimes intentionally.
Well, I hate to bring it to a close, but if we're talking about the terroir of people, I have really enjoyed the terroir of the people this evening in our conversation. I have just learned so much. I wish I could just listen to you all evening, but I do need to let you get back to your lives. So let's transition to our dessert course. This is where we each share something we have been enjoying this week. I'll just go first really quickly. I have just over the weekend, I recommended something like 3 times to 3 different people, so I have to recommend it to you all as well. Speaking about aromatics, this is a non-alcoholic beverage. It's called Aurora Elixirs. A friend of mine is their sales director, so I am a little biased, but they are hemp and hops beverages. They're sparkling, and the aromatics they use are I just love smelling them. So they have like a pomelo sage and a spiced orange bergamot and all these wonderful aromatics. And yeah, being a wine geek, even if I'm not drinking wine, I still want something wonderful in my glass I can just shove my nose into. So yeah, who else has a dessert item to share? Who would like to go next?
We went to visit my mother-in-law, who lives in West Marin, and she had mentioned she's originally from Norway, and she had mentioned that she really wanted salmon. So we found literally, hours since it was swimming, fresh Chinook salmon out of Bodega Bay here in Sonoma County, and poached it just in the most delicate herbs and lemon and olive oil, good olive oil. I'm pedantic about using good, high quality olive oil, and just the flavor of just barely the fish had this beautiful sea flavor, mixed with the abundantly fresh herbs, was so delicate and delightful, paired with a Russian River Pinot. I'm going to remember some of these meals that you eat. You remember for decades, and this is one of them for me. So I had to share that.
Harold, did you bring a dessert item to share?
I did. Nothing edible or drinkable, actually, but a book. So, as I mentioned, I was overdue with my book by 8 years, which meant that I didn't have time to read anything else. I'm now trying to catch up, and there's a wonderful book from the late 90s by a writer named John Lanchester, and it's called The Debt to Pleasure. And the thing about it is that it's narrated by a single person who is both obnoxious and wonderfully insightful at the same time. It turns out that he's not to be trusted, and the last few pages are surprising. I'll just leave it at that. It's a wonderful kind of mystery how it all unfolds. But I just wanted to give you a taste of the wonderful aspect of this. It's all about food and drink. The guy is a snob. The narrator is a snob. So he can be obnoxious, but he's also clearly eaten and drunk a lot. And he makes these wonderful summaries of his experience sometimes, one of which is about the basic culinary brilliance of France. He says that the French are simply competent. They're competent in a way that manifests itself as the sensuous science of ordinary life, the application of intelligence to pleasure. And that's what Hoby was talking about, bringing pleasure into everyday life by understanding what it is that we can get from it.
Oh,
I'm
wow.
going to pick that book up soon.
Yeah, I'm putting it in my library queue as we speak. So, Martine, what is your dessert this week?
I have what is an invented category of wine. It doesn't have a long tradition at all, and it's mainly been fueled by the rosé frenzy in the U.S. for the past several years, and it's a wine from. I'm actually just finished it out, and I drank it out of the bottle right now because it's that kind of wine. It's a Chacolina, or some people, you can call it Chacolina as a region or Chacoli as the wine, or vice versa. I forget. I always. But the point is, it's either usually a white, slightly frizzy, wine that's perfect for warm days. Or maybe 5-6% or so is made in red, a different version from the Basque region in northeastern Spain. And recently, I don't know how recent, but recent enough where people are like, "Yeah, you guys are just going after the American crowd," which is relative. Is not a lie. The rosé, or rosé made of the white and the red grape, and this is Ulacia. I think it's Ulacia or Ulacia. It's not Italian; it's Spanish, so it's Ulacia from my buddy Mike Miller, who is an importer for Golden State down in Los Angeles, and he shipped me some Spanish wines because I had to do a masterclass in Tempranillo. And then I said, you know what? You've got a few slots. Throw in something that is just refreshing because it's kind of warm, you know. And I just guzzle this. It's 11% alcohol. It's the perfect wine for a warm day, and the rosé is just like, yeah, legit. I'm digging it.
Love it.
Oh, I love those chocolates. I could
Making me thirsty.
So good. Well, thank you so much, fabulous panelists. You were amazing. Listeners, you can find Dr. Hoby Wedler online at hobywedler.com. You can find Harold McGee online at curiouscook.com. You can find our co-host, Martin Reyes, online at reyeswinegroup.com. And you can find me, Catherine Cole, at catherinecole.com. But of course, where I want you to go is theforetop.org. And here I am signing out from the high-fiber, protein-packed city of Portland, Oregon, in my kid's closet, as usual. This is also known as my recording studio. Thank you all so much for listening. Thank you so much, panelists. You were so fascinating. And listeners, hey, we want to hear what you think about this episode, so please visit theforetop.org, where you can find our social media handles. Please get in touch with us. Please subscribe to The Foretop on your favorite podcast app, and leave us a rating on Apple Podcasts so others can find us. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.
This has been The Foretop Podcast. Catherine Cole is our executive producer, Izzy Kramer is our senior producer, and I'm Keelan King, sound supervisor. We are also assisted by audio editor, Michelle Richards, our production assistant, Rachel Grossman, and our social media assistants, Lex Rule and Nick Toole. Please visit our website, theforetop.org, to learn more about us, listen to back episodes, reach out to us on social media, and purchase books written by our amazing panelists. And if you have not already subscribed to The Foretop on iTunes, NPR One, or Spotify, please do so and leave us a rating. Stay safe out there, and thanks for listening.
Oh, wait a minute. Are you still there? Oh, well, if you're still listening, then I need to tell you something. I need to tell you about the fabulous swag over at sparklingwineanytime.com. Sparkling Wine Anytime is, of course, your favorite new book about all things bubbly, but it is also a wonderful website designed by our team, Lex and Rachel, and we have gifts and goodies galore for you. We have sparkling wine-themed beach towels, teas, cocktail napkins, fancy wine flasks, adorable tote bags, and more. And guess what? Your purchase will help to support a favorite cause of ours, Ahivoy, that's AHIVOY, check it out, which provides education and career training to vineyard stewards in the Willamette Valley. So it's a win-win for everyone, and who doesn't love sparkling wine anytime? Please head to sparklingwineanytime.com. We would love to see you there. Thanks. We love you all. You're wonderful. Kiss, kiss.